Hello, I'm Matt Galloway, and this is the Current Podcast.
Change so you can afford a home. Change so you can afford food. Change so your paycheck rises faster than your cost of living. Change so you have safe streets and crime-free communities again.
We can lead the energy transition while ensuring affordable energy at home and building the strongest economy in the G7.
Ottawa works best when one party doesn't have all the power, when we're there to hold them honest, when we're there to make sure that things get done.
If you're counting, it's day 23 of the campaign. 2 weeks to go. Tariff whiplash, polls, pipeline politics, the leaders' debates this week. To walk us through it all, I'm joined once again by our national affairs panel, Rosemary Barton, the CBC's chief political correspondent and host of Rosemary Barton Live. Stephanie Levitz is a senior reporter with the Globe and Mail's Ottawa Bureau. And Ryan Tumilty is a political reporter at the Toronto Star. Friends, good morning.
Good morning.
Rosie, I asked you this last week and the week before, so with a couple of weeks to go, what have we learned about the campaign last week? And let's maybe begin with this television appearance last night on Tout le monde en parle. More than 1 million people often will watch this in Quebec, and you had Pierre Poilievre and Mark Carney there under the heat lamp. How did they do?
Yeah, it's a really important sort of cultural event, that show. For people that aren't familiar with it, it's a lot of fun, but it is also serious. These are not easy questions, and Pierre Poilievre got that last night. Questions like, why are you doing so badly in the polls? Are you a mini Trump? And he did his best to try and defend some of his positions and his ideas, but it was a bit of a rough ride, I would say. He also got asked about defunding the CBC. And was sort of told off by the host, Guy Lepage, that wasn't a good idea, that public broadcasting matters. So, the outing was fine for him. I would say he didn't have very much to lose. Mark Carney had a lot more on the table because Mark Carney needs to keep and pick up seats in Quebec if he wants this majority government that he's campaigning for. And we've talked previously about his French. He also did okay. But I would say it was a test of whether he understands Quebec. And he had clearly done some homework. He was able to cite at least one Quebec band that he knew of.
Cour de Pirate.
That's right. And then there was this really key moment, which might not sound like a big deal for the rest of Canada, but the sort of co-host or the sidekick asked, well, do you know the name of Guy Lepage's comedy troupe? And he managed to remember that it was Rock et Belles Oreilles. And that was, the audience gasped because they weren't sure that he would get it. And I know that sounds silly, but it was a sign that he does have some understanding of Quebec culture and why it matters. So I think that was a fairly good moment for him last night.
Ryan, do you want to pick up on that and talk about what we've learned since we last spoke a week ago?
Yeah, I think for both of them, last night's performance, as Rosie quite eloquently put it, it was a test, and it was this opportunity to show Quebec that you are, worth voting for. And I think, Mark Carney has won the support of people in Quebec that in a way that a lot of political observers find surprising. Because his language skills are not great. I mean, they're better than mine, but that does not make them good. And culture and identity are so important to people in Quebec. But I think in this moment, where the bigger threat to Quebec's culture and identity is coming from south of the border, Mark Carney is getting a pass. And so, performing okay last night on that stage was really important, but it sets up a French language debate this week. If the questions were tough last night, they'll be much worse at the French language debate.
We'll get to that in a moment. Steph, from your perspective, and you can talk about Quebec or the rest of the country, I mean, all of this is kind of folding into the last couple of weeks and how people are thinking across this country about this campaign. What have we learned?
So one of the things I've observed over the last week is Mr. Poilievre trying very hard and through different mediums. Tout le monde en parle would probably be like the cherry on top of the sundae, where he's trying to humanize himself to voters, right? Recognizing some of the criticism that's coming at him. Not just the questions about the persistent questions about Donald Trump and his campaign, but who he is as a person. And there was a line last night where, he was talking about the difference between being the leader of the opposition and now running to be prime minister and the shift in his tone. and how, he needed to shift from being this attack dog guy to giving people hope. There was a similar version of that question for Mark Carney, which was, do you feel like running for being the prime minister is easier or harder than being a candidate? And he talked about broadly, like how much more difficult he finds politics. He finds being prime minister easy. And so there you almost have two images of this campaign. On the one, you have Mr. Carney, who all but waltzed into the prime minister's job without really having to work for it that hard. And then you have Mr. Poilievre, who's trying to get himself there, but needs to basically undo people's perception of him for the last 3 years. And I think that's the tension for the last 2 weeks, is which one of these guys is the one that Canadians believe going forward.
It's interesting, Rosie. We talked about this last week, crowd size and whether crowd size matters. There was this huge rally in Edmonton. Pierre Poilievre posted on social media saying 15,000 people came out. There were some, and it's hard to tell how many, but there were some Conservative supporters who were suggesting the size of these crowds mean that the polls aren't to be believed, that there's more support for Conservatives than the polls would suggest. The CBC poll tracker suggests that the Liberals still have a fairly significant lead. How should people look at polls, do you think, a couple of weeks going into the vote?
Well, that's a hard question, because I don't think people should actually look at polls to make a decision, right? I actually don't think that's how you should choose your vote, although I know that there's strategic voting and all that kind of thing. But if you are observing the polls and just want to try and understand what's happening, they really haven't moved very much, frankly, in the past week or so. They have got to this sort of static point where the NDP's collapse is holding, and the Bloc Québécois as well. And that is what has led to this huge increase in support for the Liberals. I think that the problem for the Conservatives is twofold. One, that those two other parties are not doing well, although that could change, and we'll talk about the French debate in particular, why that might change. And the other is what we call favorability, right? Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre, and that speaks to what Steph is saying. People don't particularly have a favorable view of Pierre Poilievre. And before Donald Trump and the departure of Justin Trudeau, that probably didn't matter as much because they were looking for someone who was sort of aggressive and a fighter. But now it does matter. And Mark Carney's favorability is really through the roof, even though people don't really know him very well. And that is a very surprising factor and hard to fight against. So those are interesting things, right? And I think we enjoy talking about polls and watching them. But I do think we should be cautious about it, because people will make their decision over the next couple of weeks, perhaps next weekend when a lot of people celebrate Easter, and they'll make a decision about who they think is best suited for this moment in time.
Ryan, just the last point on polls. Last week, this got all sorts of attention. Doug Ford's campaign manager, former director of communications to Stephen Harper, Corey Tenike, blasted the Conservative campaign. He said, and he used language that I can't use on a family radio program, but said that blowing a 25-point lead and being like 10 points down is campaign malpractice at the highest level. Do you think that, is there a concern that the obituary is perhaps being written while the patient is still on the operating table?
Yeah, I mean, he was being very critical of Pierre Poilievre, but also of his campaign manager, Jenny Byrne. I think a lot of us have questioned why the Conservative campaign hasn't really pivoted. I was at two Pierre Poilievre media events this weekend. They felt like I could have the same way they felt a year ago. His tone, what he's talking about, have all remained the same while the world has kind of been upended. That said, Jenny Byrne probably knows more about campaigns than anyone, especially Conservative campaigns. So, she could still surprise us all. There is a chance, but it is starting to look like this campaign won't change and the polls won't change.
What does that infighting tell you, Ryan?
It tells me that the Conservative Party, both the Liberal and the Conservative parties are big tent parties. But the Conservative tent has always had many, many more sharp edges. And I think what you're seeing here is that, for Conservatives like Doug Ford, who just won a massive majority, looking at the federal Conservatives and seeing them lose a potentially massive majority is really distressing. And it's suggesting that they were right about what a conservative should be in this country.
Steph, last week, Liberal leader Mark Carney paused his campaign, for the third time to deal with the trade war with the United States and put on the cloak of Prime Minister, such as it is. Yves-François Blanchet, leader of the Bloc, Pierre Poilievre, both criticized Mark Carney for skipping the campaign trail. Pierre Poilievre says that Mark Carney's in hiding. Is that a fair accusation?
It's always tricky for prime ministers when they go back to campaign because they do wear two hats, and we've seen it in every election.
And the hat looks very similar. The hats look very similar in some ways.
Yes, and that's the challenge for Mr. Carney, right? Is that the hat is the very thing he's running on, right? It's a bit of a one-note campaign from the Carney Liberals: Trump, 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 and plenty of folks have observed in political forums like this one that every time Mr. Carney goes in front of a microphone, maybe with the exception of last night on Tout le monde en parle, he tends to make mistakes. He makes gaffes. He screws up. And so having him put on the prime ministerial hat reminds people of why he's campaigning, the sort of salient features of his campaign, to do what he did this past week, which was to say that, there was an urgent matter he had to take care of. He had to go convene a cabinet meeting, and then to refuse to take questions sort of cast some doubt on what was so urgent about this and why aren't you talking to reporters?
I just wonder whether whether it's fair to say that he's in hiding or whether it's unexpected in some ways. And it goes back to what you said about what he said last night on Tout le monde en parle, that in some ways he enjoys being the prime minister more.
Hiding seems like one of those words that's politically dancy, right? I mean, the Poilievre conservatives used to accuse Justin Trudeau of being in hiding all the time. And I recall that the Trudeau Liberals would get their backs up and say, you're importing American language and that's not fair. Hiding, is it hiding if he's in plain sight? I mean, he did come in front of the cameras and made some remarks, right? The question is, what was the legitimacy of the decision to, quote unquote, pause your campaign? And when you pause your campaign, are you actually pausing it? Are you pulling down all the ads? Are you stopping the social media posts? Are you telling your candidates to be quiet? No, you're not. So why are you doing it? What is the thing that needed to be done in that exact moment that is not campaigning? Otherwise, it just looks a lot like a kind of campaigning.
Presumably the candidates will be kind of juggling that between being public and being tucked away somewhere to prepare for these debates coming up in the next couple of days. Rosie, the assumption is that Mark Carney is going to get the majority of attention. What does he need to do and what does he need to avoid doing, do you think?
I think the two debates are different. First of all, I should point out, because David Cochran knows more about sports than I do, that there is a Habs game on Wednesday, a Montreal Habs game, and so there is concern that there won't be as many viewers of the French debate, and that's part of why last night was pretty important.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so we'll see, if the same number of people watch the French debate. In that one, I think there's a real potential for Yves-François Blanchet to punch through. In the past two campaigns, he's managed to do that, partly because of him, partly because of some other circumstances that rose during the debate.
A question that was asked during the debate.
A question that was offensive to him, and he seized it and ran with it. So I think there is a possibility for things to shift a little bit there for the Bloc Québécois. The English debate is something different, and I would say this: normally debates are when people check in. That is not the case this time. People are checked in. They're paying attention. So Mark Carney is now going to be under attack. He's going to be under siege by all of these people. And I don't know how that's going to play out, frankly. He will struggle a bit in the French one, for sure, because he just doesn't think as quickly on his feet. And in the English one, does he hold himself like the front runner, like the prime minister, and just try and take it? Or does he fight back in some ways? I think that's going to be fascinating to watch, because we haven't seen him in these kinds of situations. And I'll just say, for Pierre Poilievre, I think if he becomes too aggressive, which he talked about himself last night, as Steph mentioned, that is really going to be a huge problem for him, because that is the thing that is turning people off, and turning women in particular off, which is a big, big struggle for conservatives.
Steph, pick up on that. Where is Mark Carney vulnerable, and where is Pierre Poilievre vulnerable in these two debates?
Mark Carney has a temper. Mark, the sort of steady ship, the steady hand, when he gets pressed on something he does not want to discuss, he recoils. He gets his back up. That's not a great look for people who are opting for change, opting for stability, telling pollsters that they kind of want a stable hand and things to be the same. So if he flies off the handle, if the other leaders can get under his skin, that will be a risk for him. Mr. Poilievre is sort of the other side of that coin. It is a question of tone. It's a question of finding the sweet spot for him. And there probably is a sweet spot for him between that aggressive, take no prisoners persona that people are saying they want a fighter against Donald Trump, but not veering into the smarmy carnival barker part of it that gives that echo of Trump for people, that makes them think of Trump as opposed to think of the guy who's going to fight against Trump.
Ryan, what are you watching for? I mean, maybe it's with Mark Carney or Pierre Poilievre. We haven't mentioned the NDP and Jagmeet Singh. And presumably this is, I don't know whether it's a save the furniture sort of approach, but we heard at the clip at the beginning of our conversation, in some ways he's making the case for a minority government.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the case he's making at this point. That is their dream scenario at this point. I think they'd settle for official party status. But, in this race that has become polarized between the Liberals and the Conservatives, the NDP need to be heard. And so this is a big opportunity for them because I think a lot of people have focused in on the Liberals or the Conservatives and maybe forgot the NDP is there. And so, they'll be on center stage. They'll be there also, of course, with the Bloc and with the Greens, who we almost never talk about anymore. But it is a big opportunity for Jagmeet Singh to make the case that more of his MPs need to be there. Because right now it looks as though not only will he lose some MPs, but he may even lose his own seat.
Is your sense that minds can be changed? That people are still trying to figure this out? We've been traveling across the country and talking to people, and there is the sense that some people have made up their minds, but still, I mean, there's a couple of weeks to go, and many people are still trying to sort through what's best for them. Ryan, is your sense that the minds are still open to be persuaded?
Yeah, I think they are, and debates are always a moment for that, right? They are a moment where a campaign can really change. I think people are starting to lock in, and I think with the pressure that we are under. But if you look at this campaign, one thing we've talked about this a little bit, but one thing that is remarkable is that even during a campaign, Mark Carney's favorables, people who think he's the better prime minister, the better leader, the better ship captain in a storm, that number has been going up, and it almost never does for politicians during an election campaign. It usually only goes down. So people are warming to him, even though, they didn't know who he was 3 months ago.
Just a couple of minutes left. Steph, is there one other thing that you'll be watching for? We'll talk again before the campaign is done. But, I mean, this is a big week in many ways.
Platforms. I'm watching for platforms. When are we going to get the full piece of what these parties are putting to voters, how much it's going to cost, how they're going to pay for them? Ordinarily, those things come out before the debates because in theory, the debates are supposed to be a robust testing of those ideas, right? Your idea versus somebody else's idea. We haven't really seen that yet from the parties. I know we've all talked about this being a one-note election to a degree, but there are other things the new government is going to have to do, going to want to do, going to need to pay for, and it would behoove them all to get those details before Canadians so people can make the choice they need to make.
Rosie, last minute to you. One other thing that you're looking for this week?
I guess I want to see whether Mark Carney can stand the pressure. He's a man who's made his way through many crises. He likes to remind us of that. I don't doubt that, and I don't doubt his ability to do that.
The cauldron of politics is different.
That's right. Can he handle the pressure of being under the spotlight and the aggression from the other candidates? I think that is a real test for him this week because, as Steph said, he can get his back up if he's feeling like he's being attacked. And if that happens this week, I think it could do something to those favorables, as Ryan talked about. But just to go back to the undecideds, I do think this weekend, which for many people will be a long weekend, will be a chance for people to sit around and talk about what they want, what they need, and what they're hearing from people, and what makes sense for them right now. I think this is potentially the moment after the debates on that long weekend when people really lock in.
We will talk again at the end of this week when it's all done and dusted in terms of the debates. In the meantime, thank you all for being here.
All right, thank you.
Rosemary Barton, CBC's chief political correspondent, Ryan Tumilty, political reporter with the Toronto Star, Stephanie Levitz, senior reporter for the Globe and Mail's Ottawa Bureau. I mentioned our election road trip. It continues this week. I'm headed to Quebec City later on this afternoon to bring you a program from there on Wednesday morning. That province is a crucial battleground. 78 seats up for grabs. Capital City is politically diverse. The Liberals, the Bloc, and the Conservatives all have a presence there. And there are big questions, as we just heard, and questions that will be addressed in this debate about what the parties are pitching and how Quebec receives those pitches. We will talk more about that from Quebec City on Wednesday.